Right. So I think we have enough people on the call now, and we can start that. So essentially, thank you for joining us today. This is actually our evening here in the UK, but thank you for joining us in your morning. The purpose of this webinar is essentially to help the various New Zealand companies who are thinking about the EU, potentially with a bit of an interest in the energy or clean tech sector, to have a bit of an understanding of the broader dynamics and agenda, along with some of the commercial opportunities that you'd want to be thinking about. To introduce us, we are Flint Global. We're a business advisory and consultancy firm with offices across the globe. Here in the UK, we've got some offices in the EU and various member states, and including in the Asia Pacific region as well, with offices in Singapore. So myself and my colleague George will be presenting today. I just want to apologise in advance. We had our Brussels colleague Gregor, who's our energy expert in the EU, who was supposed to be joining us and co-presenting today, but unfortunately he wasn't able to join due to a family emergency. But the two of us will cover the basis of the webinar, and if there are any questions at the end that we think would be best placed with Gregor or the European team, we'll take those away and put those to him. But just to introduce us very quickly, George is a senior advisor in our team, and he's in the trade and market access team here in the UK. He is an international trade expert, and he will sort of speak towards the end of the webinar. Myself, I'm Catherine. I'm also in Flint's trade and market access team, and prior to joining Flint, I used to work for the New Zealand government, working for New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, so somewhat uniquely positioned to help think about New Zealand companies in the EU context. So we're going to speak for about 30 minutes or so, and then there's an opportunity for questions at the end. And as I said, if there's anything particularly technical or gritty that should go towards our colleague, we'll make sure to send those on. Essentially, also, this webinar is based on a piece of work we did with the New Zealand government last year, which was following the implementation of the New Zealand EU Free Trade Agreement, which came into May, but in May last year. And I think already a lot of that context and environment has changed since we wrote that report, and we are operating in a completely new trading environment and global context, which we'll cover a little bit within this webinar. So to start off, I want to set out a bit of the context and what this means for New Zealand. So firstly, just setting out the view that the global transition to clean energy is still continuing, with the EU leading the way. So I think under that, Europe has quite a specific commitment to achieve climate neutrality by 2050, which in the EU is driving quite a significant increase in demand for clean technologies. I think more broadly, of course, particularly this year, we are seeing somewhat of a global rollback with some of the more ambitious net zero and green agendas from various countries. And I think that's, obviously due to some political and economic reasons. In the UK, for example, we saw last year the Labour Party, before it got into government, roll back on quite an ambitious 28 billion green investment pledge, which they watered down in response to concerns about some of the economic realities of it. But despite this, we are still seeing this global trend. We are still seeing the EU push forward and seek to lead on the green and net zero agenda, but framed in a bit of a different way. I think the EU is definitely seeing some rollback, and we're seeing, and particularly when it comes to regulations, we're seeing a lot of delay as the bloc works out what it wants to do and when it wants to impose new regulations. But George will speak to that a bit further. In terms of the actual broader context, we've seen a bit of a move from a focus on climate to industrial policy opportunity, rather than that specific sort of climate objectives. But the wider agenda remains. And a crucial part of this agenda is the EU rapidly scaling its capabilities in renewable energy. So in the EU, that particularly is focused on solar, wind, nuclear, and battery technology. And there's also quite a growing trend towards emerging solutions such as carbon capture and storage. But there's also a wider trend that has informed some of this. So I think within the past few years, we've seen a bunch of global shocks. And we have also seen COVID and Russia's invasion of Ukraine sort of exposing the vulnerabilities in the global energy supply chains, and the EU felt quite a brunt of that. So, as part of that wider agenda, the EU is particularly accelerating its efforts to reduce reliance on high-risk partners within its energy supply chains, which includes China and Russia. So, in the EU here, within the energy sector, the EU is heavily dependent on China for clean tech and within its energy supply chain. I think that China has quite an outsized role in the EU's supply chain. I think there's something like over 90% of solar panels and quite a significant share of battery components are sourced from Chinese suppliers here in the EU. The EU has taken some steps to try de-risk itself from China, and I mean, it's not necessarily consistent across all of the EU. Sorry, Delphine, I'll just go backwards. But basically, you know, there has been a bit of a trend towards trying to de-risk from China. You know, so we've seen within the EU taking the lead on imposing tariffs on Chinese imports, such as Chinese EVs, making it a bit more difficult for them to access the EU market. But I think what's quite different this year from last year when we did the report is also a big focus of this de-risking strategy on the US. So over the past few months, the past 6 months really, we've seen tensions between the US and the EU grow, with uncertainty around US trade policy, which very much stems from the return of Trump. And that's kind of created a bit of urgency within the EU's diversification strategy, with the bloc looking to diversify away from the US and China, but also looking to deepen its international cooperation elsewhere. And a big part of that political momentum is to sort of friendshore supply chains and work with trusted, like-minded partners to source key technologies and components. And I think within that context, New Zealand is quite a natural strategic fit. You know, New Zealand has strong sustainability credentials, an innovative tech sector, and a bit of like a global green brand image that gives it a bit of a competitive edge over some other international partners that would also be looking to enter the EU market here. And as part of like the EU looking to diversify its clean tech supply chains and the manufacturing base, it kind of opens up a lot of real opportunities for New Zealand companies to access this, whether it's the clean tech space or companies within the renewable energy sector to look to sort of enter and scale up in the EU market, potentially probably where there wasn't as much of an opportunity before. So I think just lastly on this, some of the advantages that New Zealand has over other players within this sort of global supply chain context is the New Zealand and EU Free Trade Agreement, which improves market access in the EU for New Zealand goods and services. So this came into force last year, as we said, and it removed tariffs on a broad range of various green goods. So that includes wind turbine towers, hydro turbines, solar panel components, and the geothermal systems as well. There's a dedicated energy chapter, which strengthens the framework for trade and investment in renewables and sort of helps level playing field for New Zealand firms by improving the access to raw materials and reducing cost barriers in market. And also important to note there that there's mobility provisions under the FTA where New Zealand businesses can send people over a bit more easily to the EU with commitments to, you know, faster visa processing and allowing short-term stays of up to 90 days per year and other certain provisions under that. And lastly, New Zealand was also the first non-European country to have full access to Pillar 2 of Horizon Europe, which is the EU's sort of main funding program for research and innovation. I think New Zealand's the only non-European country with this access aside from Canada and South Korea. And it essentially allows New Zealand companies the ability to lead and collaborate on energy and climate projects on the same terms as the various European participants. And more than just like the funding opportunity that provides, there's also helps, you know, build credibility in the market, creating like relationships, partnerships with the relevant people, and it sort of links New Zealand companies with EU customers, researchers, and various investors. So that's a bit of the context and what sort of New Zealand's role within this all looks like. But I'll pass to my colleague George now to discuss the EU's energy agenda and the wider regulatory landscape and what that means.
Yeah, Thanks, Catherine. Lovely to be here with everyone this evening, this morning, depending where you are in the world. Really interesting market access environment, I think, is the headline when it comes to the European Union at the moment. For those looking to start their export journey there or expand it significantly when it comes to sort of the clean tech and the renewable energy space. What is the headline figure? And I think this is the important one when looking at the European market is that there is, by quite conservative numbers, really around between 400 and 600 billion euros per year needed in terms of investment, greenfield, brownfield investment, into the EU's energy system in order to meet all of those objectives that Catherine was talking about. And they are quite, a multitude at the moment, whether that's meeting their net zero objectives all the way through to de-risking from the perspective of some of the Russian energy dependencies that they have, and also trying to de-risk the Chinese supply chains that they have. So a number of policy motivations when we look at the European market at the moment, but nonetheless, there is quite a lot of investment going into trying to make that happen. Question about whether that's enough, I think that we leave that to the politicians, but there are very serious objectives in each of the EU member states in order to make this happen. In particular, France, Germany, Spain, Italy being probably the biggest markets in terms of where those investments are taking place at the moment, but also not to forget the real decarbonization needs of the Czech Republic, Poland, etc., and some of those other EU member states at this time. So, macro picture, really quite a lot of investment needed and being committed by both the European Commission and those EU level authorities, but also at the EU member state level. That's pulling through into different regulatory initiatives that are taking place at the moment with the EU's green energy agenda under the previous European Commission, that was the Fit for 55 package. So Fit for 2055 in order to try and achieve those net zero objectives and really bring down those carbon emissions and really aimed at aligning all of the EU's climate and energy targets. That's been modified quite significantly over the past couple of years. You have now the Repower EU plan, which is really aimed at rapidly and phasing out dependency on Russian fossil fuels. And then in order to supplement that, we've seen the development of the clean industrial deal, which has mobilized around 100 billion euros to try and boost competitiveness and accelerate the renewable energy adoption across the different EU member states and upgrade the energy system. Interestingly, that's also been accompanied by a real simplification of the state aid rules when it comes to how individual EU member states are investing in their energy systems and what sort of companies are able to do so, particularly trusted companies. So those that are in the FTA partners and those sort of criteria that Catherine was talking about before. Where the sort of that green industrial deal is really focusing its attention at the moment, one is definitely on those energy intensive industries. So those are your steel, metals, chemicals that really do need to decarbonize in order to meet the EU's energy and sort of broader climate objectives. And also, frankly, and this is, I know it's a recorded seminar, but also some of the primary concerns there around the cost of production within the EU. Some of those really high energy costs and electricity costs are causing competitiveness concerns. So there is an increased focus around that decarbonization in order to try and really drive a decreased and increased competitiveness when it comes to cost production of those different products and steel, metals, chemicals, as I mentioned. They're also looking to really try and boost the clean tech sector and build partnerships. Part of that is also not just on the funding perspective under the Clean Industrial Deal, but also really around boosting research and development. And we've seen quite a few different incentives come through from that perspective, but also looking to build partnerships with different countries on top of existing trade arrangements under sort of clean investment and trade arrangements in order to try and boost that sustainable trade beyond just the normal commercial arrangements that exist between the EU and other jurisdictions. So there is an increasing focus from the European Commission in trying to make that happen. And those clean tech partnerships are definitely part of that conversation, without any shadow of a doubt. There's also an increased focus on circularity. Fundamentally, we all know that when it comes to critical minerals, that there is quite a significant dependency, both in terms of where that production is happening around the world, but also where the processing is taking place, particularly China, very well documented. Around 90% of the world's critical minerals are processed out of China. And the EU is really looking to try and de-risk some of those dependencies through the increased processing and recycling of those different materials going forward. And I think any initiative that exists in that particular space is going to have a particularly interesting and good reception just because of the nature of the types of projects that exist out there at the moment in that space. So all of that to say, there is a huge amount happening in terms of moving from this EU Green Deal that was, very much around how does the EU meet its climate objectives through to how is that being implemented at a sort of both a member state level, but also on a energy sector perspective that I'll come onto in a second. I just wanted to take a bit of time also to touch on some of the market access commitments that the EU has taken on top of those free trade agreement aspects that Catherine mentioned. That it's worth noting, definitely depending on your perspective, can either be viewed as a impediment or a potential opportunity when we're talking around the carbon border adjustment mechanism or the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the CSDDD. As we know, the EU is an absolute alphabet soup of acronyms, and apologies for sort of occasionally delving into them. But I think it is worth noting that while, yes, the EU-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement certainly does offer beneficial and preferential market access in terms of, getting into the European market, those market access conditions are changing on a fairly regular basis, and it is worth keeping in mind how that is happening with regards to any particular products that you are looking to export to the EU market, particularly in the context of the carbon border adjustment mechanism. I mean, just to go through some of the clean tech sectors that are listed there on the left of the screen that you have. As we know, solar, a lot of the actual um, frameworks that you put solar panels on, they're aluminium framing, so can be covered by the CBAM mechanism. When it comes to wind turbines, largely steel, aluminium, concrete when it looks at the actual turbines and the nacelles in terms of how you actually construct them. Batteries, again, heavy aluminium components and some of the heat pumps as well. So Just to bear in mind that while, yes, there is definitely preferential access in terms of the EU market, it is worth bearing in mind some of those other conditions that are required to enter the EU and just take them into account when looking at the market. Definitely not in many instances from the clients and the companies that we work with something that stops companies trading, but just is an additional step that requires a little bit more consideration as part of that broader market access consideration for the European Union. Just wanted to take a little bit of time and look at some of the other aspects in terms of the subsector opportunities in the EU at this point in time. Wind energy is a huge focus for many of the EU member states, most notably Germany, France, Denmark, Belgium, Spain, and Portugal. Um, Huge ambitions to expand wind capacity by 2030, as you can see there, and sort of significant investments coming through the wind power package. That is also being boosted by the recent announcement by the UK and the EU as part of the broader reset in order to boost investment in the North Sea and some of the energy cooperation there, potentially unlocking quite significant investment across also Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and the UK into wind energy. So something that's actually quite positive in terms of how that market is developing and also some of the auctions that have recently taken place in terms of individual member states, sponsoring and investing in different projects. E-mobility and EV infrastructure, I think globally we're seeing a little bit of pushback in terms of investment in that space, but nonetheless, in terms of a regulatory perspective from the EU, still very strong commitment on the shift to electric vehicles, um, particularly in terms of building up the EV infrastructure and charging infrastructure across the main EU member states in order to make sure that there's not just the number of EVs and the production capacity, sort of seeing some of the recent investments in batteries in that space as particularly pertinent, but also making sure that the actual electric vehicles themselves are able to access the charging networks and some really interesting market opportunities occurring in that space and expertise that, looking to tap into. Germany and the Nordics primarily leading the way in that particular regard. Around battery technologies, really interesting on top of the actual R&D aspect to the clean energy transition that the European Union is trying to promote at this point in time. And I think particularly relevant for those looking to access the Horizon 2 R&D funds that Catherine mentioned at the beginning. That is really where quite a lot of those funds we're seeing being deployed at this point in time. But there's also the corresponding projects that have been recently announced as part of the critical mineral strategy. So the EU's announced, I think it's 26, 27 new projects around the world in partnership with different countries ranging from Latin America all the way to the Pacific to try and boost that battery technology aspect of their energy transition, which is really driving quite a lot of R&D opportunities and also looking at sort of non-lithium opportunities in particular as well. In terms of how those battery opportunities are developing at this point in time. Finally, hydrogen, definitely a core focus of the decarbonization efforts, looking in particular at the Repower EU that I mentioned earlier around how different EU member states are looking to wean themselves off Russian gas. Still, as we know, blue hydrogen is probably the most common in terms of investment at the moment, so that mixed hydrogen use, but really looking towards additional funding and research to move into green hydrogen as quickly as possible, particularly around the electrolyzers and different aspects of converting the material into hydrogen. So that shift from blue to green definitely a core priority in the EU at the moment. And I think really interesting market collaboration opportunities for New Zealand firms. So just wanted to give a bit of a snapshot there in terms of where the EU, yes, we know those headline figures, significant amount of money being invested between sort of 300, 400 billion a year needed in order to achieve those objectives. Definitely driving down into those subsectors that we were covering and some real opportunities as well in order to make that happen. So I'm going to stop there and pass back to my colleague Catherine. And if you have any questions, would be more than happy to answer them at this stage.